They say a desert keeps secrets because there's nowhere soft to set them down. Mine rode with me like a flat rock in my boot, always there, never bleeding, making every mile longer than it had to be. The winter I decided to speak was the winter the San Pedro ran so thin you could wade it at noon and not wet your knees. Calves bawled at dry troughs, and the mesquite threw shadows like barbed wire. I was 42, old enough to know that a silence can outlive you. My place sat where the cottonwoods begin to give up, and the hills start lifting their shoulders. 3 rooms of squared timbers, a lean-to barn that leaned too much, and a stretch of fence I'd tightened a dozen times and never trusted once. The South Spring, Sweetwater, bubbled under a lip of limestone a quarter-mile east. Folks said my father had won it in a poker game from a miner who didn't understand water better than whiskey. That was the first lie I ever agreed with by keeping my mouth shut. Years after he died, cleaning out the trunk he never let me touch, I found the papers that told the truth. A deed recorded when the county clerk was drunk, a survey that slid a boundary stone 3 rods west, a letter from a Boston syndicate promising my father a fee for cooperation on any future dam site. I became the sort of man who checks a lock 3 times and never sleeps like he means it. The other papers in that trunk were worse because they were mine. A ledger kept by a foreman named Rusk, horse letters and hash marks, and a column of numbers that belonged to the mouths of cattle and went instead to the bank accounts of men who thought God had given them the county as a rehearsal dinner. In that ledger was my name beside 3 sums. Each week I rode fence for them. Each week I told myself this was just work. The work was surveying, which meant I counted springs and marked where a thin-walled arroyo could take a weir, and I made notes about who used what water when. That last part wasn't writing, it was betrayal dressed as inventory. I told myself I was a hand, not a judge. The last entry had the worst number I know, 0, for courage. The other truth I carried was small and sharp. 2 summers earlier, pushed by young men who thought intelligence is a mistake, I'd strung 2 strands of wire across a narrow cut in the willow draw to turn back a herd. In the dark, a pony ran it. Come sunup, a boy led that pony down to my fence with a rope and a face set hard against crying. He never looked at me. His grandfather did, quiet, not accusing, weighing. They said little. They cut the wire, wrapped the pony's wound with shredded shirts, and left without asking for anything I couldn't bear to give. I took the strands down and threw them behind the barn, as if metal shamed by daylight could make me a better man. You see why the rock in my boot never let me forget it. By the time the grass crisped white at the tips, word ran through the valley that a company lawyer had come to town with a map crisp as a hymnal, showing a dam stepped across our canyon like a courthouse ladder. The dam would back up water across the willow draw and the low mounds beyond it, mounds where women in fall scraped sage from the ground in widening circles and never made jokes. I knew because I had watched from a distance and later learned what a man should have already known. Those mounds marked where their people slept without waking. The lawyer said the company had rights to all unclaimed flow. My rock in the boot learned to grin. I could have pretended longer, men do, but drought and age and a boy's steady back will set a clock in you. One cold afternoon I boiled coffee, cut my last loaf in half, and wrapped the foreman's ledger in oiled cloth, the deed in an envelope, and my pride in a prayer that had no church to keep it. I hung a strip of white cloth on a willow near the barn door because a woman from the valley had once shown me that color when she wanted me to put away my gun and speak like a neighbor. Then I rode east toward the basin that turns blue when there's no reason for it, a place where the Indie, who we called Apache because we didn't ask enough questions, sometimes camped when the wind stayed civil. At the edge of that basin, where the snow lies thin and the pinon smells like a memory trying to behave, I tied my horse in the open and sat on a rock where any man with eyes could see me. I set the coffee on a flat stone, took the cylinder out of my Colt and laid it in line with the cups. I talked to the air the way my mother had talked to a grave, soft, Not because she believed the dead would hear, but because she didn't want the living to misunderstand. I didn't wait long. Waiting is for men who think they're choosing. 4 riders came from different corners, as if the land had thought them up. They circled slow, not like wolves, not like guards, just like people who have weathered enough to know geometry gives you time. The last to approach was a man with hair the color of thunderheads, just before they satisfy themselves. A grey that isn't defeat. He wore no feathers that would have suited a postcard. He wore a jacket sewn by someone who loved needles and the patience they require. The young man I'd seen that summer, pony-cut, face steady, rode 2 horses to my 1 and did not glance at me. The older man stopped 10 paces off and let his horse breathe. He did not say chief, because that is a word we use to keep our understanding small. Later someone told me his name in their language meant the road that chooses the river. When he did speak, his words were the kind the country understands. Few, placed where they'd hold. He touched 2 fingers to the white strip by my barn, then to the empty cylinder of my Colt, then to the coffee cup, asking 3 questions without stealing my language. I nodded, slid the second cup toward him, and waited to hear what my mouth had never practiced, the truth lined up end to end without a guard. "Sir," I said, because Mr. felt wrong, and his name felt like a stone I hadn't earned, "I come with bread and shame." The young men said nothing. The older man did the smallest thing that is still a blessing. He looked at my hands first. He saw they were empty and asked for my words without making it a mercy. I told him about the deed, my father's lie, the clerk's bottle, the survey stone moved after dark. I told him about the Boston Syndicate and its letter, about the foreman's ledger and my name written in it 3 times when the winter was hard, and I forgot that character is what you do when no one pays you to behave. I told him about the wire across the willow draw and the pony that paid. I told him about the map of the dam the lawyer unrolled like a blanket over the dead. I told him the law would eat their valley and call it improvement, because no one in the courthouse wears mud after noon. Then I did the one thing I had practiced and still dreaded. I opened the cloth and slid the ledger and the deed toward him, with both palms flat on the earth, a way a man shows he wants to quit defining the world by where his fingers reach. The young man moved, finally, just his eyes, to the older man's face, the way a boy looks when 2 roads he's never walked meet. The older man didn't pick up my papers. He picked up my bread first. He didn't eat it. He broke it and set half on the ground between us, as if to say, we can talk as long as we remember this is not theatre. Then he touched the ledger with 2 fingers, as a person touches something hot that is still useful. He spoke their name for themselves, and the people, and then kindly said we in my language. We remember water better than men remember paper, he said, making sense out of things I had done a poor job of understanding. Water keeps a map under your feet. Paper keeps a map in the hands of men who sell to men with clean boots. You bring paper, it is good. You bring mouth, it is better. His eyes flicked toward the west, toward town, toward the dark shape a dam would draw on the sky. You bring shame. If it stays only in you, it is a stone. If you set it down here, it can be carried away. I told him I wanted to set it down where it could do work. I told him I would sign a quitclaim deed for the South Spring, Sweetwater, and for any strip of land a straight man could say had been chewed off their side of the world. I told him I would testify under oath to the ledger and the bribe and the moved stone. I told him I would stand on the courthouse steps and say out loud that I had been hired to help build a map that saw their dead as an inconvenience. I told him I did not want forgiveness. I wanted a fence taken out of my soul. They will come, he said, and I understood he meant more than his riders. He meant the deputy who liked to bite the ends of his gloves as if law were a bone, the foreman who kept his ledger clean and his conscience cleaner, the baker who listens better than she speaks, the people who love this place in different languages, and the men who think the desert is a window they can wipe clean and fill with themselves. They will come, he repeated, and looked past me toward my 3-room house. They will want to stand at your table. Will you lay the truth there where your bread lives?" I nodded. I told him I would set a white cloth, and under it the ledger, and on it the deed and my pen. "Guns sleep first," he said, the same words I had once heard from a woman in the valley who had disentangled a pony's fear before touching its wound. I held up the empty cylinder and the Colt separate, an old dumb liturgy that still has uses. He leaned forward then and did the unexpected. He touched 2 fingers to my chest above the place where my stone had ridden for too long, and said, "Men do not grow lighter, they grow more honest, and the weight shifts." The riders melted back into the basin not like ghosts, nothing mystical about it, just like people who know leaving less dust behind buys you time to work with. I rode home. I hung a white strip on my door and a red one above it because sometimes men need a color to remember their hands. I tidied my table the way you wash a body before a funeral. I boiled coffee. I listened for hooves and felt the world take a breath that is both relief and alarm. They came in 2 groups because life likes to braid trouble with help. From the east, the riders from the basin, older women with braids the color of steel, boys who have learned to look before they talk, a man whose laugh made the dogs choose to trust him. From the west, the deputy with 2 men who were not law and liked borrowing its vocabulary, and behind them Mabel the baker with a pot wrapped in a blanket because she understands more treaties than any of us. The deputy forced his horse into the yard and said my name like an accusation. The older man from the basin sat his horse as if he had waited in this posture for a long time, and it hadn't made him tired. I stepped into my doorway and lifted my hands, palms out, and then let them fall. "Guns sleep first," I said, and because words are weaker than examples, I set the Colt on a peg out of reach and slid its cylinder across the table like a coin I was not going to spend. The deputy chewed the end of his glove and glanced at the foreman behind him, at the ledger under my white cloth, at the faces in the yard. He did not climb down. He said, "Caleb Hart," my full name, like he was opening a ledger of his own. "You're harboring hostiles." "I'm harboring neighbors," I said, not because I felt brave, but because the sentence was easier than any apology I owed. "And I'm telling the truth. Sit down and hear it." He didn't sit. But the old man from the basin did, eyes on the strip of white, fingers already reading the shape of our mourning. He didn't reach for my papers. He reached for my cup, and when men drank, the law got smaller and the story got bigger. The deputy shifted in his saddle as if a horse had just remembered it could refuse him. I moved the ledger to the edge of the table, above the place a man's hand stands when it swears, and said the words that moved my stone for the first time in years. "This belongs to all of us." That's the moment when the story turns, if you need a hinge to remember it by. The confession was a tool, but the table was the workbench. Everything that happened next, what we signed, who we called, what we stopped, found its shape, because fear didn't get to sit at the head of the table. We set a place for it at the corner, as a warning and a lesson. Then we began. Outside, hooves moved, more riders, not fast. The foreman whispered to the deputy, and the deputy put his hand on his holster like a man remembering a bad habit. The old man put 2 fingers on the ledger and waited for me to speak. I did, and the morning decided to become a different kind of day. If you want to know how a table becomes a courthouse without betraying the room it lives in, watch how people stand around it. The deputy stayed in his saddle, which makes a man taller but no wiser. Mabel set her pot of beans down at the far end, where heat makes hunger behave. The older women from the basin edged so they could see the white cloth without letting their skirts brush my chair, a courtesy my mother would have liked. The boys stood back, the way boys do when they're measuring a story's shape before they decide whether to tell it back later. The foreman kept his hat on because some men think a brim is a halo. I laid it out, the deed my father shouldn't have had, the letter from the Boston syndicate naming Sweetwater as a proposed acquisition, The survey with the boundary stone switched like a cup trick, and the ledger that reported in tidy columns that water is most expensive where poor men drink it. I didn't give a speech. I used nouns and verbs, places, dates, names, dollar amounts that gave courage to a lawman later when he needed something to hold up to his sergeant. The old man, call him Nantan if you must, though he didn't need the sound of authority to convince you he had it, took the deed by the corner, the way you take a snake behind the head, firm enough that it can't bite, gentle enough that you remember it's alive. He didn't read. He looked at my face and then at the map on his own hand, the creases that had learned the ridges and arroyos when the rest of us were still guessing. He spoke a few words in his language to the boys and then said to me, "Water remembers us. It will remember what happens here." The deputy finally dismounted, not because he wanted to, but because pretending you're taller doesn't work when women with white hair don't even bother to look at your belt. He came to the table, stood too close to the beans, and peered at the ledger as if numbers might flinch. "This is theft," he said, "meaning my father's deed, meaning the clerk's bribe, meaning my part in the survey, and also not meaning any of it. Not yet." He needed to decide which side of the sentence he would live on. "Good," said Mabel from the far end. "Name it right. Then reckon it. Who's hungry?" She ladled beans into cups, because a cup makes a body remember it can be held. We made a strange picture. Settlers and the people, a deputy deciding where law would stand today, a foreman keeping his face symmetrical as if he'd practiced in a mirror, and an old man waiting for the part where the world would prove it could be better than last year. Someone from across the yard said, "Guns sleep first," because the color red above my door wasn't enough. The deputy put his hand on his holster and then took it off, 2 inches of humility that cost him pride he didn't need. Now, paper has its uses. But it isn't a god. It needs a frame and a voice and a table that means it. We built all 3 right there. I took a clean sheet, wrote "Quit-claim deed, Sweetwater Spring, and the land required for access" at the top, and then, with hands steadier than I deserved, wrote the legal description copied exactly from the false survey, except for the part where I moved the boundary stone back to where it belonged. My pen leaked once, like a nosebleed, and then behaved. I signed. The deputy watched my hand, as if it might spook. The old man didn't reach for the paper. He reached for my shoulder, squeezed once and let go, an act that translated into every language we needed. "Who will hold this until ink becomes action?" I asked. "I can," said Mabel, "because bakers have been notaries longer than the state. But take it to the recorder before the sun sits down. Don't let the dark touch it first." We drafted a second paper that wasn't law but deserved to be, a written understanding between my ranch and the people who use the willow draw about the spring, the fences, the path of the cattle and the path of the ponies, about traps, none in the draw, about storms, help first, talk after, about guns, sleep first always, and about the red cloth, hung when words get lost on their way to the mouth, and the white, hung when a child walks into a yard. The old man leaned over the table then, and with a small piece of charcoal, he drew on the margin a line for the creek, a X for a fence post that needed moving, a circle for a mound no man should plough, and a handprint, his, where the words said, "We will meet here when the water rises. We will decide together when to cut the rails." The deputy cleared his throat. "You can write whatever you like," he said, almost apologetically now, "but the company holds permits." The dam would flood their dead," I said, and didn't need to say more. Mabel set down her ladle. "Charlie," she said, speaking the deputy's given name the way a grandmother uses a middle name when the day is about to teach you something, "do you want your daughters to learn that a ledger beats a grave?" The foreman finally spoke, in a voice that sounded like an invoice. "This is sentiment," he said. "We have capital, we improve. Water unused is water wasted." He had chosen his words in a tent with a lantern, not in a canyon with a sky. The old man didn't answer him. He stepped to the doorway, pointed up canyon where the dam would throw its shadow and said, "We use water with our dead. We teach our boys where to say thank you. Does your map show where to say thank you?" The deputy surprised us. He picked up the ledger again, flipped past my name to others I recognized and wished I didn't, and then to a column marked OT, Officers' Tips. He closed it like a man who has just learned something true about himself, either that he's weaker than he thought or stronger than he feared. "I'm calling the recorder and the Indian agent," he said, "and the judge, today." He turned to me. "You'll ride with me, Hart, and swear." "Sir," he said to the old man, lifting his chin not in challenge, but in respect he had discovered he could afford, "you'll send someone you trust. Not because you need our court to be a people, but because this is the court we have." The old man nodded once, then said something to the young rider who had brought 2 horses in the summer. The boy stepped forward and touched his chest. He would ride, not with words, but with presence. Some days, that's the evidence that convinces a town. We moved then, with the clumsiness of men who have to make justice and still get hay in before dark. Mabel wrapped the quitclaim in a towel the way you carry bread, because bread and law deserve attention to their temperature. The old women gathered their skirts, and one of them, without asking, took a broom to my floor and swept as if to prepare the room for what would be remembered. The old man took my white strip and folded it, then hung it on my belt himself, a small ceremony that said, "Wear your mouth where you can reach it." The ride to town is 3 miles, but when you ride with a confession behind you and a promise in front of you, the miles combine in new math. The deputy pushed his horse, then made himself slow. We came into the square with the ledger carried openly like a flag no man would salute, but many would respect. The recorder's office smelled like ink and resignation. The deputy set the papers down, and to his credit, the clerk sobered even before he realized who else stood behind me. He read, he paled, he stamped. The sound, thunk, thunk, turned a private shame into a public fact. At the judges, things went like they do when dignity and panic share a room. He heard me, he read the deed, he swore in the boy, and then didn't make him speak, because the boy's presence said enough about whose water this was when heaven surrenders rain. He wrote an order with the precise anger of a man who has a daughter, temporary injunction on any construction at the canyon, criminal referral on the clerk who had taken whiskey for ink, a request to the Indian agent to open talks about easements that wouldn't trample memory, and a note to the newspaper editor, a woman who would write more exacting stories than sermons. The foreman tried once more. "You can stall," he said to the judge, to me, to the old man, to the people in the square who had drifted up to see what noise looks like when it wears a tie. "Capital waits for no one." The judge put his pen down and stood. "Capital can wait for conscience," he said, "and I wanted to put that on a sign above my barn. You can make a victory out of that and go home." We didn't. We went back to the table because nothing worth keeping survives on paper alone. We hung the white cloth and the red, and while Mabel's beans solved arguments the law never heard, the old man and I moved a fence post together. It's a small thing to say, it's a big thing to do. The boys watched us operate a post-hole digger like 2 men who had learned the same tool from different fathers. We set the post 6 paces back, where the old stone had been before ambition and arithmetic made new geography. We stretched the wire and stapled it, and then, the part that mattered most, we stood together and looked at a world that had made room for a correction and hadn't collapsed. Days followed. Rain came grudgingly and then in a rush, because it likes to make men pay attention with extremes. The injunction held. The clerk resigned before the sheriff could serve the warrant. The foreman took his ledger and left, and in leaving admitted what he denied all morning, that a book of numbers can be moral or not. The Indian agent, to my surprise, visited with a woman from the valley who had more law in her head than most men have in a barn. They spoke of easements and passages and the way to write down a path so that a child can take it without asking permission from a man who likes to hand out permission like bread. They spoke of water rights and use, of an idea someone called a reserved right, that meant the people claimed their share because the country itself had promised them something when it drew a line on a map. Words that would become a case a few years later and a doctrine a few years after that. We were ahead of the law by a winter and behind our dead by a lifetime. But for once, we were pointed the right way. My quitclaim became an entry in a big book. Sweetwater saw women kneel there again when the willow went gold. I kept a bucket there and 2 tin cups. I put a spoon on a peg by the stove, a gift from the old man's sister, a willow spoon with beads at the neck, triangles the color of mourning. I cooked beans and hung the red cloth on days when words couldn't find their shoes, and the white when a child came through my gate with a question larger than hunger. The boys from the basin grew into men with laughs that made my dogs decide quickly. They helped pull a heifer out of mud after a spring thunderstorm. I brought meat when one of their ponies tore a flank on a post that should have been smoother than it was. When the newspaper told the story, it was shorter and sharper than the one you're hearing. It said, "Rancher surrenders spring, court halts dam, clerk resigns. Unusual cooperation between settlers and Apache families averts conflict." It didn't say beans or white cloth or a hand on a shoulder. It didn't say how my confession did not excuse me, it employed me. It gave me chores, testify when a man needed help telling truth to power, shut up when my words would only make me feel better, move a fence when a stone says it belongs somewhere else, teach young hands to bend wire without cutting it, watch water and memory, both of which take the shape of their container if you're not careful. The old man came less often as the years took him the way hills take a sunset. When he did, he would sit with his back to the door and his eyes on the basin, the posture of someone who likes his surprises to come from sky, not from men. Once, late on a summer day when the cottonwoods sounded like they were whispering a secret and wanted you to hear it, he said, "Your mouth learned. It brought your hands with it." I told him mine was the easy learning. "No," he said, "easy as a fence. Hard is taking down what you built when it kept you warm in a bad winter." He died in a season when the mesquite went extravagant and the rains came on time. I stood at the meeting place in the draw with others who knew how to wear respect without putting on a costume. We didn't say much. We didn't need to. The boys, men now, set a handprint in mud near the creek, like the old man had done on my paper, a way to tell any passerby that a promise had been made here. I went home and made coffee and hung the white strip where it could see it was not just decoration. Years pass and a story cools to the touch. You pick it up and see whether it still has uses. Mine does. Sometimes a stranger riding past will ask, "You the fellow who gave away a spring?" I say, "No, because giving implies ownership. I gave back what never belonged to me, and life made me taller for the bending." Now, if they ask whether it changed anything, I point to the fence post that moved and didn't move back, to the path through the willow that children use without looking for permission slips, to the bean pot that is never quite empty, to the spoon on its peg and the 2 cloths above the door. Here is the confession that matters now, the one I didn't know to make then. I used to believe a man is the sum of his holdings. Now I believe a man is the sum of his corrections. What I told the Apache chief, what I told the old man with thundercloud hair, didn't make me good. It made me available to good. It made a line across paper turn into a path across land, and a ledger turn into evidence, and a table turn into a place where neighbors eat and reckon and hang the right color for the day. If you pass my place and the white cloth is out, you'll know a child came. If the red is out, come anyway. It means I am learning again how to keep my mouth from racing my hands. If neither is out, knock. I may be in the drawer, moving a post you'll never notice, because that's the point. And if someone asks you what changed everything forever, tell them it wasn't the confession. It was the way we set it on a table between bread and water and agreed to live like the truth deserved more than ink.